to the Chipstone Session at the 52nd Annual Conference of NCECA. I want to remind you all to silence your cell phones, if you could, before this talk, although encourage you to Instagram or Facebook about the session using hashtag NCECA 2018. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Chipstone Session, its origins and purposes. NCECA first began a dialogue and what's turned into a wonderful friendship with the Chipstone Session and John Prown, its director in particular, in late 2012 as we were beginning to plan for our 2014 conference in Milwaukee. I visited the Chipstone Foundation, which is in Fox Point on the outskirts of Milwaukee by the lake. It's a remarkable place that too few of us in the ceramic art and education field are aware of. It has a world-renowned collection of British and American pottery and furniture that was collected by a single family. But even more remarkable, the foundation that was established to preserve that collection has done so with tremendous vision. And Chipstone has created partnerships and affiliations with both the Milwaukee Art Museum and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and generated programming that's really enabled us all to look at making and material culture in new and contemporary ways. Most notable of these is the exhibition program that they do with the Milwaukee Art Museum that included Theaster Gates's To Speculate Darkly project, which kind of unearthed and made contemporary the work of Dave Drake, which has now become so much a part of our contemporary discourse. Also, a special program called Object Lab, by which they bring together scholars and students from a whole variety of disciplines to really explore what material culture means in terms of our handling and observation, our ways of interpreting objects. When we began this friendship with John and Chipstone and talked about NCECA's ability to reach an audience that really should be more aware of this program, we also talked a lot about Chipstone's interest in expanding audiences in the field. And really what we've been trying to do with this session is to move it away from a traditional, distinguished, specific historical lecture to a session that really looks at problems of making in more diverse ways than they've been looked at in the past, and with a particular interest in looking at the work from the perspectives of audiences that and makers, the generators of the content that maybe haven't been as well featured as they should have been. So in the spirit of that goal, this session brings together John, as well as Jesse Albrecht and Namita Wiggers and Janet McCall, each of whom has been a kind of hero to me in my own life and work. Janet and I have known each other for probably nearly 25 years. She is the director of Contemporary Craft, which is hosting the NCECA National. And under Janet's leadership, she's taken the model of a kind of a traditional craft museum and created an exhibitions and education program that really is built on the central principle of embracing communities that wouldn't necessarily come to a traditional craft media exhibition. So she'll be speaking more about those projects and the way that she's engaged people from the sectors of social work, dream analysis, psychoanalysis, housing, healthcare, and members of the community. Namita, who's sitting next to her, is the founder of Critical Craft Forum. She had also been the director of the Museum of Contemporary Craft in Portland, where she done similarly progressive and adventurous programming, exploring the past in interesting ways and really bringing the community into the museum. She is now launching a new program and an MA in craft history with Warren Wilson College, and Namita will be kind of the person in the group that will be addressing the future of the field and how we look at the field. Sitting beside her is Jesse Albrecht, who is a newer friend to me, who I've really just gotten to know over the past few months as we've been putting this panel together. And Jesse is a maker, an artist, and a healer. I would say. He was midway through graduate school at the University of Iowa when he learned that his National Guard unit was being redeployed and that he was being reclassified as a combat medic, and was it one tour in Iraq, during which he was on the battlefield treating those who were subjected to tremendous violence and trauma. And he's dedicated his life since returning to working with veterans and their families and using the modality of clay and paper and other craft practices to kind of make shattered lives whole again to the extent that they can be. And John, of course, will be talking about some of the programs that I've mentioned and other ways that Chipstone is continuing to evolve the DAVE project moving forward. So, thank you.
Oh, look, we got a step here.
You want to slide?
Yeah, I'm going to. Thanks for coming out this morning. When we think about the question of craft histories, specifically whose histories are told or represented and whose are overlooked, there are a whole lot of things for us to consider, beginning obviously with situating the discussion at this sort of particularly bizarre moment in time that we're all living in. Questions of inclusion, diversity, accessibility, and the like are especially potent in our current and highly combative cultural and political climate. Many progressive-minded museum thinkers and forward-thinking art initiatives are still running up against considerable time-worn institutional and intellectual barriers. In fact, just this week, Namita and I were talking about this, a leading and very talented curatorial voice for expanding diversity and a strong critic of overrepresentation of white male artists in the museum world, Helen Molesworth, was fired by LA MoCA for, quote, undermining the museum, a move that's really aroused a lot of concern within the art world, even among some of the board members at that museum. And at the Quai Branly in France, that institution has prevented its curator, Sarah Ligner, from speaking to the press about the implied issues of power and colonialism in the artworks that are included in a new show called Paintings from Afar. They are looking at colonialism, but they don't want to talk about it. These broader issues are relevant to our time and our topic today in raising questions about representation and definitions in the craft world. Now, I'm not going to dive deeply into contending definitions or accepted understandings of the term craft, but I will note that they can be problematic. It's not as if it's a fixed word with one meaning. It's used differently by different people, different institutions, different scholars. And some of these terms effectively, although unintentionally, can function to exclude rather than to include. And much has been written and said about this. For example, we have sort of the problematic and rather artificial division between traditional craft and studio craft, which can reflect embedded racial, ethnic, class, and gender biases. At the other end of the spectrum is sort of the popular culture, suburbanized notion of craft as a form of making that is simply fun and leisurely, what Sarah Archer describes as play that is designed to look like work. Suffice it to say, the word is complicated, and while our task today is not to enter into the definitional fray, what you will hear are some important alternatives and I would argue really timely interpretive and operative pathways, very inspiring projects. As a topic of consideration, the good news is that craft is on something of an upswing right now with the wide popularity of Alexander Langland's well-conceived and sort of lovely nostalgic book, Craft, an Inquiry into the Origins and True Meaning of Traditional Craft. That's C-R-A-E-F-T. And he suggests now that we pronounce it creft as opposed to craft. But it's a really great book. You all should take a look at it. We also have Ezra Sale's Shape of Craft, which foregrounds the figure of the industrial artisan alongside vernacular basket making and other traditions. This summer, we'll see the publication of Glenn Adamson's important new book. Glenn was our former Chipstone curator. His new book is on material intelligence. It's called Fewer Better Things. Generally speaking, these books and many other projects breathe new life into the mid-19th century art reform theories of Ruskin and Morris, as well as educational reformers like Rousseau in France, Pestalozzi in Switzerland, Froebel in Germany, Otto Solomon in Sweden, all of whom believed that making by hand enriched the soul and engaged the mind, and that making, therefore, was an essential part of learning and the human experience. In these most recent publications, and in our work at Chipstone, we see a return to the idea of craft with a lowercase c, a more humanist global reading of it, not as a specific category of things, not as a fixed art historical category, but rather as an essential process, indeed part of our fundamental human DNA, that we are in danger of losing in this industrialized and increasingly digital world in which consumption is the norm and hand production is the rarity. Our panel today will explore multiple dimensions of craft, and I'm going to talk specifically about expanding issues of craft diversity as it relates to the museum world, since that's where so much of our work takes place, those places where so-called craft objects are sewn along so-called art objects. When we consider the panoply of making in the Americas over time, we see that many art and decorative arts installations are unmistakably Eurocentric in emphasis, primarily privileging craft created by white makers, especially those who made things for affluent white clients. Works made by indigenous, African American, immigrant, and anyone else deemed as culturally, racially, ethnically, or emotionally other are often put into different museum spaces, effectively ghettoized in ethnographic, folk, visionary, or outsider galleries and the like. In this manner, the museum presentation of craft can end up being as much a political gesture as an aesthetic one. At Chipstone, we've adopted some alternative interpretive and display strategies that strive to address some of these imbalances. On the screen, I'm just going to really blitz through a bunch of slides. On the screen, you see Chipstone, which is located in Fox Point, north of Milwaukee. We're a private foundation. We do a variety of things. We do publications, including Ceramics in America, which is sort of the journal of record for historic ceramics. For about 20 years, we've had a very innovative relationship with the Milwaukee Art Museum, where they effectively allow us to come in. They give us galleries and allow us to come in and fully curate those spaces to be deliberately, purposefully experimental. It's really been a very novel partnership that I'd say has gone on for about 20 years. We've done, over the years, over 50 shows, I think. Many of these are on site on our website. In full, all of our shows are recorded as full virtual exhibits, so you have access to those, and those include things like Theaster's exhibit. We do a lot of work with Art Babel as well on the educational side, doing videos that empower both students, professionals, artists, other curators to become involved, to collaborate with the thinking and interpreting of objects. I think we have about 150 videos up now. Our exhibit work, rather inadvertently, in the mid-2000s, led to Chipstone getting involved with the National Think Tank program, where other organizations, museums, both big and small, historic houses, museums with period rooms, and universities come to Chipstone to come in and lead ideational sessions that are meant to bring together sort of unexpected voices that help push an institution forward. But many of the institutions we deal with express a strong desire to figure out ways to move forward, to increase relevance in the 21st century. They just don't really quite know how. We come in, we don't have the answers, but we sort of know a process, which is to bring in not the expected people, the fellow curators and all that, but really unexpected voices who will help push the museum. We also have a sort of wide range of research projects that are found on our website and are worth exploring as well. Curatorially, we have some basic ideas that we try and pursue, and this notion of tackling difficult stories is essential to what we do. And then tied into that means you have to share or even hand over curatorial authority. And that's actually something that most museum practitioners don't comfortably do. Museums aren't really known well for playing with others, and curators really typically want to control the voice, the words that are on a label. We feel that the process has to move forward differently. So I'm just going to give you some examples of how we deal with a variety of craft issues, both historic on up through contemporary. We did a show a number of years back called The Cost of Things. And obviously, on the one hand, as you see this slide, we literally looked at the cost of things. We went back to figure it out historically, what was the price difference between an earthenware pot, a stoneware pot, a porcelain pot. Then we brought those prices up to date to give people a sense of the relative cost today. So we had that. But then we also thought, well, when it comes to making, what are the other costs of things? Well, there's the physical cost of making. There's the human cost of making. So, for example, that Charleston double chest that you see there, yes, that might be associated with the South Carolina shop run by Thomas Elf, but as in many colonial furniture shops from north to south, you had enslaved workers doing much of the process who were dying from the awful living conditions, malnutrition. Many of the materials they were working with were carcinogenic. You look at some of the other objects that are being made at that time. You have mercury poisoning in the looking glass industry. You have tinsmiths and metalsmiths going deaf. You have lace workers developing eyesight and spinal cord issues from working 14 to 16 hours a day. And then obviously in the ceramics world, you go to the Staffordshire district in the late 18th century forward, and you had young women who were the lead glaze dippers. So they're dipping their hands into barrels of lead glaze, knowing that they're going to die in their late 20s and early 30s. We also have taken a role in thinking very strongly about African American decorative arts. We've set up in Wisconsin what may be one of the only dedicated African American decorative arts galleries, and part of what we're trying to do in this space is to really empower the stories of the makers, to not just fetishize the objects and to put them into a kind of a dry historical context, but to really think about the experience, the role of the maker. One of the things we've done is gotten very involved in thinking about face jugs, these South Carolina stoneware face jugs, often very small, 4 or 5 inches tall, that for over a century have been part of discourse within the American museum world and in ceramics books, but typically described as being just small little water pitchers that were whimsies that were created by the enslaved workers when they came home after a hard day's work. Well, I don't think so. And so in the 2013 edition of our journal, we really explore a different relation that links these to a West African, specifically a Congolese tradition, a Minkisi tradition of ritualistic practice and conjure. In fact, these jugs had a purpose within the African American community. It's a story that had long been stifled by many American museums and actually has continued to have been not accepted by some of our peers in the museum world. And the imagery, the histories related with these objects are really quite astonishing and often very troubling. Here you see this amazing picture that was done. In 1882, Oscar Wilde visited America. The Saturday Evening Post did a cover that described him or presented him in a very insulting manner. They described him as the aesthetic monkey. J.A. Palmer, 6 months later in 1882, did a photograph. This is the only surviving historical photograph of a face jug, and it includes a young African-American male, and it was entitled The Aesthetic Darky. So it was playing off that Saturday Evening Post cover. These are the stories that need to come out about these objects, and we tell these stories and others in our Dave Gallery. The Dave Gallery actually really is conceived less as a fixed gallery, but really as an ongoing project, a set of initiatives where we're revolving stories in and out, bringing in different practitioners to think about what's going on. The two pots you see out front, there's on the lower right is an amazing Dave pot with very much sort of a Japanese aesthetic. On the left is the only known example of a pot by Harvey Drake. Harvey Drake trained Dave to be a potter. He also owned Dave. So these stories are very impactful, and especially in a city like Milwaukee, where segregation is still very much an issue. We have amazing objects like these two chairs that are associated with Thomas Jefferson. The one on the left is a Louisiana Campeche chair that was gifted to Jefferson in 1818. The one on the right was made a year later by John Hemmings. On site at Monticello, Hemmings was Sally Hemings' brother and an enslaved joiner. Jefferson appreciated these chairs. It was late in life. He had rheumatoid arthritis and was complaining about his discomfort. So John Hemmings had to make a chair for free as an enslaved laborer to improve his master's comfort. Complicated object. One of the things I'll also say is that the way we communicate, at the Milwaukee Galleries, we have over 100,000 school kids who come in each year. So we didn't want to get bound up in normal curatorial jargon-filled labels. And we have a wonderful docent program. Over 200 docents work at the museum. But we also communicate visually. We worked with a wonderful artist named Matope Johnson, who came up with these images, large-scale, beautiful pastel portrait images that help drive the story for the students who are, so when you have 30 students sitting in a room, if they can see a picture that contextualizes an interpretation of the story, that helps out. We do lots of different programming in there as well, and this, in fact, is Matope at work. A totally different way that we engage ideas of craft is, again, instead of just putting them into a space that describes contemporary studio craft and thinking about it either historically, aesthetically, or by material, we did a gallery called Neo, where we're really thinking about contemporary makers who are very much inspired by older objects, the kinds of things that we have in the collection. And so we hooked up with folks like Jim Rose, a Wisconsin maker who emulated a very famous American 18th century cupboard, did it in found steel. You have Jennifer Anderson, who works on replicating historic forms, but does it out of topsoil Elmer's glue around a metal frame. We took a very famous object in Chipstone's collection that was a faked object and worked with a contemporary glassmaker named Beth Littman and allowed her to do, instead of a conventional conservation treatment, we handed it over to her, this idea of sharing authority, and we let her do a kind of redemption on the object. We also very much feel that it's important to embrace the power of wonder if we're going to get people these days interested in objects. So we create spaces that are meant to be kind of like period rooms, but you know, your normal period room, you can't walk into it. So that's not much fun. So we create spaces that are much more interactive. You can sit in here, you can engage physically with the objects. We try and work around this idea of the historic Wunderkammer. We worked with a contemporary artist named Martha Glowacki, and again, we handed off interpretive power and to her to think about her objects. So she would look at a Newport high chest, for example, and she was very smitten by the animal feet, sort of the zoomorphic quality. So instead of just sticking this into normal art historical terms, we let her think about how to interpret it. We created our own cabinet with non-historical but more fascinating categories about fakeness, bizarreness, gold, and the like. We also think a lot about expanding the kinds of outcomes. So again, collaboration is very much built into what we do. This is a project we did with Fo Wilson, a wonderful Chicago-based artist, where we created Eliza's Cabin, which is built around a fictive enslaved girl who collected. But we've had music programs, interpretive dance programs. We let students get involved. And again, some of these are listed on our site. We also have a series of podcasts. And I'll just sort of click ahead to a final space. When we think about the historical forces, the cultural forces that shape the world that I work in, sort of dealing with colonial objects, it came out of the Centennial period, which, again, was a very Anglo-centric, affluent, white-based activity. We've gone in a different direction. We've crafted a room that is developed around a fictive but very strongly historically based character named Mrs. M. Mrs. M is a character of non-defined racial, ethnic origin. She is, to put it briefly, she's a real ass kicker. She's a doer, she's a thinker, she's a maker, she's a traveler, she's a collector. This is her space, and it's built around her collection of 17th century ceramics. So it allows Chipstone to privilege our collection, but really we work through the lens of Mrs. M. And when you cross the threshold into this room, there's nothing that says you're in a 21st century gallery. She does all the interpretation. It's all done in her words, her handwriting. You engage her in a Pepper's Ghost historical-based video where she describes the nature of her collection. And it allows us to enter into sort of topical discussions that you otherwise couldn't do in a conventional gallery. So we do salons, we bring in music, we deal with issues well beyond normal art historical categories as they relate to making and craft. So we think about race and ethnicity and materials and cultural implication and the like. In any event, that's just sort of a quick look, and I know we look forward to hearing the other speakers right now. Thank you.
I'm Janet McCall, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I want to talk about our organization, Contemporary Craft, which is a free nonprofit arts center with a 47-year history of presenting high-quality, innovative work by nationally and internationally recognized artists. And I'm going to share how we've deepened community partnerships and engagements through a series of social justice exhibitions that bring diverse groups together to discuss and respond to challenging subjects such as violence and mental illness. This all grew out of an initial show called Enough Violence, Artists Speak Out. Community response to Enough Violence was so overwhelmingly positive that we knew we had to continue it. What is now a biennial series has addressed homelessness and displacement, and next year we'll be looking at food insecurity. Much broader in scope than our typical exhibitions, these socially engaged art experiences, as we call them, are complemented by companion shows at our satellite gallery or other locations, and they also include university lecture series, collaborations with social service partners, and outreach programs and hands-on art making. Visitors have multiple opportunities to experience the topics through powerful art that allows them to share stories, talk with the makers themselves, and our hope is that they leave with ideas about how they can become part of the solution. There are free downloadable curriculum guides and catalogs that help teachers and families learn positive ways to have conversations with young people about these subjects. I have a few images from each show, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about our process and how that evolved, our partnerships, and how they've helped us deepen our community connection. I'm going to stay on this just for a minute. This is a life-size installation by Claudia Alvarez, and it was placed at the entrance to the Enough Violence show, Artists Speak Out. It literally stopped visitors in their tracks. Here's a little more about how the show came about. In 2010 or 11, Dr. Rolf Lober, a former board member and psychiatrist renowned for his research on the life course of delinquency in boys, approached our director of exhibitions, Kate Lydon, and me with a question. Would you ever think about doing an exhibition about violence? Kate and I looked at each other and thought, whoa, that's a challenging topic. Neither he nor we could have anticipated just how much that simple question would change our organization. In discussing whether this was something we would want to take on, we grappled with lots of questions. What would our position on violence be? Would we remain neutral and simply present the work, or take a strong advocacy position? We had concerns about sensationalizing the subject. Would we turn off donors or trigger visitors who found the topic too difficult? Were there enough artists even doing work on this subject? As it turned out, there were many artists who were eager to show work on this topic that was important to them, but in fact, there were limited venues willing to take this on. So it did seem like this was a need. We had a lack of knowledge, though, about violence and worried about our inability to thoughtfully address the subject. Still, we were intrigued about the possibility to do successful community building through art. Dr. Lober helped us navigate the subject matter and convened an initial meeting with colleagues. Their interest encouraged us to move forward. We still knew we needed significant support from partners with expertise. But by approaching the subject of violence through the lens of art, which was our expertise, we could offer a safe space and an insightful way for the community to come together. We hoped that this show would help us build new audiences. As with most art organizations, we had struggled with reaching younger visitors and more diverse audiences in particular, and we had limited resources, a small staff, small marketing budget, a lack of networks into new communities, issues with the identity of craft, As you know, it can be difficult to explain the meaning and value of craft, and many people just don't think art could ever be relevant to their lives. As a funder told me when I took my job initially at Contemporary Craft, I like you and I think you do good work, but let's face it, craft is weird. From a marketing perspective, you're only ever going to appeal to a tiny percentage of the population. I've spent most of my career determined to prove him wrong. By taking on an urgent concern such as violence, we felt we could demonstrate our relevance to more people. Eventually, we settled on 4 goals for the show, and these now guide all of our social justice exhibitions: to create awareness and open dialogue surrounding urgent social issues, to validate the human experience by showcasing art infused with personal stories and perspectives, to demonstrate that art making is a vehicle for open communication, healing, and compassion, and to engage a broader community in supporting positive social change. This is called Implosion. It's a Band-Aid mandala, and it was hand-stitched by Beth Barron. This was also in the Enough Violence show. She told us that what inspired this piece, which became a series of large-scale mandalas, was that she was going through a very difficult time in her life. She was in pain, and she stood and looked down one day and saw a used Band-Aid on the ground. And it made her think, someone else is suffering like me and needs to be healed. She began to see more and more Band-Aids as she walked about and became more and more painfully aware of all the wounds that were out there, and began to think about community healing by stitching these Band-Aids together. So moving forward on our violence show, we needed to figure out how we were going to find the expertise to guide us. And our conversations eventually kind of moved into a partnership structure that has really helped us as we've continued with the other shows as well. So we identified 3 or 4 top thought leaders, major organizations working in violence prevention. We asked to meet with them to test out our idea and get their feedback, and we asked them about their constituents, goals, challenges, and other organizations to approach, and talked about collaborative programs we could do together. These groups were involved at the deepest partnership level with us and had extensive networks to share. We also drew on them to assist us with essential staff training. We needed to know how to support visitors who might have a difficult response to the show or just need other assistance. And they helped review text panels and labels, made us aware of language sensitivities. This helped us feel more confident that we were approaching the subject in a responsible, inclusive way. The second level was education partners. We approached universities and asked them to co-sponsor a lecture series for their students and faculty that we could also open to the general public and our visitors. The series focused on current research on root causes of violence and innovative solutions. What was actually working in the field on the problem of violence? These talks offered new ways of shaping conversations about things that otherwise seemed to be overwhelming or unsolvable. These partners were really excited about also building our show into their curriculum and committed to bringing their students for tours, art making, and discussions. And then the final level was all other groups that we connected with, and as time went on, we found more and more partners who wanted to get involved. So we asked them to provide related literature and resources for our visitors and to commit to staffing a Saturday information session in our gallery to talk directly with the visitors. And then we created a website where all of the partners could list their information about other programs. This is David Alexander. He's from Glasgow, Scotland, and he was a resident artist. We wanted to have diverse community members have a chance to see themselves and their lives reflected in our show. And in particular, we were looking for people who were not typical museum visitors. So we placed David as a resident artist with a group of adjudicated youth who had been sentenced to spend time in Schumann Center. And he was the ideal match. As a metalsmith, he works with young people in Glasgow who have experienced violence firsthand in their lives. He connected with a Pittsburgh artist on the Talisman Project, and they worked with the young people at Schumann Center, making art that focused not on violence, but on how these young people could work toward peace in their lives. Many of their families came to opening night to see their work displayed, and they were incredibly proud. Another non-traditional group of visitors was Women in Recovery, who literally spent hours in our show. They created their own talismans, added comments to our solution station wall, and before leaving, they came to us and wanted to share their personal contact information. They said, "We want to talk to other women who perhaps have been affected by violence and help them." This is just a screenshot of the website that we produced for the show. This is actually for our shelter show, but it shows you, it gives you a sense of the breadth and range of groups, large and small, who worked with us. And many of them also took the opportunity to ask if they could hold their own events in our space. So there were a lot of things like networking events and volunteer recognition, professional training that happened. Given the high attendance and really strong feedback that we got from Enough Violence, Artists Speak Out, we then immediately began planning for our next social justice show. Mental illness was identified as an urgent community concern that would be important to address. A key goal of this show was to eliminate stigma around mental illness. This grassroots method of promoting the show, these small handheld cards, was something that our marketing manager came up with, and we produced them months in advance of the opening and began distributing them. They invited intimate conversations about mental illness and really led to some unexpected connections. Giving out these little cards was like giving permission to people who had been waiting for permission. People I had known for years in a variety of ways, as well as recent contacts, funders, coworkers, neighbors. As I gave them a card, there would be a pause, and then they would begin to say, "Well, you know," and they would go into their story, whatever their connection was. And so many of us have been touched by mental illness in our lives. It gave me a chance for me to share a story as well. Lived experience was another important term that we learned from our partners. We needed to consciously seek out artists with lived experience with mental illness, not simply those who were working as advocates. We put out an open call to be more inclusive and representative in the art we selected for the show. We were overwhelmed by the response and could only include a limited number in the main exhibition gallery, but it was so difficult to turn people away who cared so deeply about this subject that we began to think about other ways we might accommodate them. The show gave artists like Rose Clancy, whose work is seen here, this installation piece, an opportunity to self-identify. She said, "I'm an artist whose life has been impacted by mental illness." We invited her to create major new work that eventually led to her identifying her own complex PTSD and to move forward in her healing. As a participating artist, she was able to travel to many other cities where Mindful was shown over the next 2.5 years to give talks and workshops, and it was a great professional boost for her as well. Opening weekend for the Mindful Show, we had record-breaking attendance of 1,300 people. Many families with small children came, which really surprised me. But they obviously felt that this was a safe, positive way to talk about mental illness together. There were so many stories we could share. And one example is a mother who came up to me in tears and said, "I can't talk with my daughter about her eating disorder right now. It's such a struggle. But I think I could bring her back to this show. We could go through it together, and it might open something up." We created a quiet place within the exhibition for visitors who needed time to be alone with their emotions. This Lynn Godley light wall called In Flight provided a refuge for visitors such as a man who had just lost his job and immediately came to sit with a friend following this devastating news. Sometimes the show was about experiencing and processing emotions without words. At other times, visitors would urgently want to talk to the artist, saying, "I have to meet this artist. Her story is my story too. Now I don't feel so alone." Another reflection area was a thought cloud sculpture that was hung in a private hallway. Visitors could post their experiences and struggles as well as messages of encouragement. Because of the numerous responses to the call that I mentioned, we ended up adding a second companion show called Community Voices in our education studio. One woman had written in her entry, "Too many people only see my illness. This is a chance for people to see me and to be empowered by sharing my story publicly." So we had this opportunity to provide a chance for individuals living with mental illness and therapists and advocates and family members to show additional work. This piece was submitted by a woman in honor of her aunt who had lived with mental illness and showed great resilience and courage in portraying her journey through art. Many of these participants also chose to make audio recordings of their stories and post them on our website. Most recently, we've presented Shelter, Crafting a Safe Home, addressing homelessness and displacement from the local to the global level. This is a piece by Charity White, who makes large-scale ceramic figures and places them on benches where people will encounter them, and then also videotapes that experience, which is really pretty incredible. So for this show, we were interested in how we could include homeless individuals, whether veterans, foster kids aging out of the system, or perhaps international refugees. And we built funding into our budget to allow that to happen through tours and other intensive programs. Our first tour for Shelter actually was a homeless group from a local men's shelter. We were quite nervous initially about what they would think. Would they be offended or put off? But in fact, they were very eager to walk through the show, share their experiences and their reactions to the art, and we incorporated their stories going forward so that their voices were part of our tours. Houston artist Clara Hogue's work brought extremely personal responses. She had personally lived through Hurricane Harvey and its aftermath. Our show opened the weekend following, and the physical and emotional trauma of homelessness as a result of natural disaster was very much on the minds of our visitors who had been glued to media coverage of the hurricane. For each of the shows that we did, we brought in visiting artists from out of town who could do intensive workshops and give artist talks as well. We wanted to include a local voice about what's going on in Pittsburgh around homelessness and displacement. This work is by Chris Ivey, a local activist who has documented the decline and then gentrification of the East Liberty neighborhood. Many residents' voices, stories, and protests were addressed in his videos, and it was a chance for the people who were included in the videos to come in and see themselves represented again on our walls. It also had great relevance to our own organizational situation. Art organizations are also at risk for losing their spaces, and they can't compete economically. So we learned some serious advocacy tools and strategy as a result of connecting with Chris. This is the closing of the Shelter show. On the last day of these shows, we usually have special closing activities just as we do on the opening weekend. There were a lot of residents who were bused in from an economically distressed neighborhood in town that is also now starting to face gentrification. And the event included artist talks, a poetry reading by a refugee poet, a dance performance created by young people about homelessness. And it was great. It was a very mixed group, lots of older seniors and lively young kids, and it was just a wonderful way to close out the show. And I think what we've learned is that with these social justice initiatives, many visitors may not come to see the art. They really are coming because of the subject matter. It's a really important topic in their lives. But once they arrive, they connect with the artists and their stories and feel empowered to share their own. and they leave having a new experience of how art really can make a difference for them. So our attendance has spiked significantly for these exhibitions, typically about 30% higher than normal. Funders have been very responsive, and we've received a lot of great recognition and visibility. But most of all, we've never heard such gratitude and appreciation from our visitors. Just briefly, I want to close with telling you about the other extremely important work we've begun in the last few years to move contemporary craft beyond an institution that values diversity to one that affirms racial equity as a core principle informing all decisions. This is Corey Carrington, our first emerging Black Arts Leader Apprentice, who was selected in 2016 and spent a year working as a full-time employee with us. This initiative, which came about actually in response to my becoming increasingly discouraged at the whiteness of our field and just lack of change no matter what. I've taught as an adjunct at a couple of universities, and I was discouraged to see that we weren't attracting students of color, in particular Black students, to take museum studies classes or administration classes that would put them on the track to get into the field. Then the Mellon Foundation study on this subject came out, reporting that only 4% of leadership positions in American art museums are Black and are filled by Black candidates, and that there's virtually no pipeline in. So if the leadership is mostly white, then who's making hiring decisions? Who's buying art? Who is making choices about curatorial approach? So we have to do better. We must do better. So we sought funding and created this apprenticeship, and we're now in our second year and seeking candidates for our third year, and in fact, the deadline is April 30th. I encourage all of you to help us spread the word. The application is on our website, which is contemporarycraft.org, or I'd like to talk with you afterwards if you have more interest. And Corey Carrington was able to be with us on staff at the time when we were fortunate to do the Sonia Clark show, Oaths and Epithets. And he participated very actively in giving tours of that show, and also partnered with the Women of Vision, a local collaborative, on programming that they did in a show that they created in response. And I have to say that it was an important lesson also for us to learn as a mostly white identifying staff that initially we were doing a lot of the tours ourselves, and Corey and a couple of our other young employees came to us and said, you know, we'd like to have the opportunity to talk about our culture and be much more meaningfully engaged. So that was a terrific opportunity. Thank you.
I don't know why I left, but I left on my own, and it won't be long till I get on back home. Oh, mama, mama, can't you see what this war has done to me? And it won't be long till I get on back home. All right, okay, so we got that out of the way. Just take a moment to recognize how lucky we all are to be able to be here in this time and place talking about art, knowing that there's a lot of rough stuff going on out there, and a lot of folks right now, struggling to get food, not to get blown up, and to stay safe where they live. And so it's a great gift that we have this time and space to be able to do this. So my family history, real quick, is important to me. That's my great uncle Everett. He was in the First World War. He got gassed. His brother got shot through his legs at Tarawa. Their other brother was at Pearl Harbor. And so then jumping other side of the family, my grandfather is sitting on an ambulance in New Guinea. He spent quite a bit of time over there. my uncle Dwayne over in Vietnam, and then that's me in Iraq. Ambulance driver. I was the same age in kind of a similar job that my grandfather had in the Second World War. So the guy on the right, my friend Will Hurd, he overdosed from heroin a year ago, and so some of this stuff, it's not going to be all Debbie Downer, but talking about what my friends and for me trying to speak to the things that I learned about the world as a soldier, and going into that with the eye of an artist, because I was in graduate school when I deployed. So we used to be loading those big kilns, but then I was in the back of a gun truck in Iraq, and so there was a lot of good stuff that happened, but there was also, as a ceramic artist, the plates that go in your vest are made out of clay that will stop a bullet, but I didn't have those, so it was like, wow, dang it, I was so close to literally being saved by clay. But so this is a version piece that's in the Amoka show right now, which is really rad, but it's got that Abu Ghraib figure with politics on it of some of the last campaigns, and some forms that I'm interested in with the ashtray and pipes in the ceramic world. It's trying to keep a little bit of humor and levity in that, but also relating to an image I saw of a Second World War photo promoting how arts can give soldiers jobs. There's a blind guy that was making a whole kiln full of ashtrays. I was like, that's pretty good. Okay, so when I was in Iraq, this is outside a monastery, some pots that were being used to brew wine, some monks. Also, the value of art history really came home to roost for me in a functional way. So I was in the back of a gun truck, and then I realized from my art history that the Assyrian Empire had their capital in Nineveh. And so over that, across the street, there's a guy bringing his herd of goats over the hill. I was like, whoa, that's really cool, because that's where a lot of this stuff happened. So then when I got back, I rode my motorcycle to Flagstaff, Arizona with a friend of mine, Brian Harper, and got into a wood firing with Don Bendel, who was a veteran. And then Don forced me to make some stuff, and that's those Abu Ghraib pictures just came out. And I realized I need to kind of give a little history of this, because some folks in the room might not remember when this came out. But I was in Iraq at the same time. Friends of mine were medics at Abu Ghraib, and they knew those people in those photos by name. And so for me, a lot of that experience is deeply connected in showing the true essence of what war does. And that's just rip any thin veneer of humanity off of it, and really quickly people are going to do horrible things to each other. That's what it is. And so it's not somebody else that does that. It's people like me that do that. And that's, so taking that image, for me, it represents myself, it represents the other, it represents me as the invader and the oppressor, and it also represents I feel, the things that I've had to do to kind of try to rectify and understand that experience, and how I saw the world was completely wiped out and had to be remade. And so this is where it's going to start getting a little bit more positive, because ceramics is a huge part of that. With that, so when I was in Flagstaff, I was firing this kiln built by Yukio Yamamoto, who was a kamikaze pilot. He never flew, right, in the Second World War. And so 40 years after we dropped 2 nuclear bombs on them, 85, they're building this kiln. And to me, that's art and ceramics, operating at its highest level of interacting as people through art as a way to communicate cultures. And so that's really cool. So some of these big sculptures, and then other opportunities with ceramics of the professors and people and mentors that I've had. Don Bendel, Don Wrights, I worked for him. Mike Weber was in the Navy. Al Tennant. I'm sure I'm missing a few other folks in there. But that opportunity to be in the LH Project did a veteran residency program. And so to be able to have that time in the studio, Thomas Orr, Aaron Toole, Daniel Donovan, Ash Curie, Jill Allen, and hang out and have fun and make stuff. And just as soon as you start making stuff, things get better, at least for me. So that is really important to really kind of explore some of these things that, understandably, it's tough for other people to kind of negotiate, that we can hold each other accountable in a way that might feel awkward for people that trying to be respectful of the experience. So Mike Weber making stuff up in the woods, wood firing, that time is just really important, and it's not always easy and pretty to watch people kind of detoxify from war, but you know, the art and the ceramics community is really well equipped to handle that, you know. And so with wood firing, you know, it's something bigger than yourself. You're working outside. There's physical labor. Like, there's value in moving stuff and cleaning stuff and these simple tasks that, you know, it's this physical thing. You're with other people. You're sharing meals. Like, it just naturally happens in a really powerful way without having to say anything. So some more crockery that I've made. And so sometimes making pots and sculptures isn't enough, so really getting in the mix with some art, being censored, had myself kidnapped, and then got the beat down and the execution. All the other people were grads and undergrads from studio areas. Do a little shock and awe performance here about the true facts. And then it's this great community of people that are veteran artists and people that are engaged in militarism and how it affects the world and often has affected people. So there's writers, printmakers, installation artists. In that photo at Blue Blue Mountain residency in upstate New York is a really neat experience. And so I really like to I've found that in negotiating these things of talking about war with people is to actually make stuff, and that again gets back to like me feeling better about the world and myself, of like when I can be doing something and it's art. It's kind of a chance to record some of that stuff you cover, and also like kind of to be able to engage around the table in the studio, I think is a really magical place. That some of these really difficult things to talk about, I think it's a really great place to do that. And so I've also found too that really bringing people who are civilians into the conversation is crucial for it, to have a better understanding of what the participants of it, how it affects them, and kind of, you know, it's challenging to the national narrative out there, which is our history is tied up in violence and wars and the justification for it. But when you're there doing it, it gets to be a little different deal. And so as my own art, I also work for a nonprofit called the Station Foundation, working with special operations families as wholes, spouses, operators, and then also Gold Star kids. So their dad was killed serving. We've got the pictures from our property. We just did this art workshop in December. Everybody got doing some collaborative painting there. Also a leadership trip to Washington, D.C. So just to walk with people who aren't artists. This is me getting to like, how do you communicate with people where like the special operations community is the most type A, hyper-masculine, aggressive people on the planet, you know, and so how do you talk to them about art? Well, you don't talk to them about art, you talk to them about stuff that's around you, and you're naturally going to come up on art. And so walking through the Capitol, you know, the crazy juxtaposition of going, some of these kids' dads are buried in Arlington, going there, but then seeing near the tomb of the unknown soldier, things that other countries have presented. There's a fucking pot in there from Japan. I was like, oh, that's it right there, you know? Like, check this out. Like, this is the highest form of respect, where we bury our dead. This is what another leader of Japan is going to present us, to our most precious, hallowed ground. Like, whoa, man, that's nuts. You know, and to have somebody that can show the passion and how much that means as we go through the world, I think is a great gift that we have, and also a responsibility. And so making paper with families, letting the good times roll on the deck, and then also getting Gold Star kids to, on a handmade piece of paper from combat uniforms, come up with their own crest for this like kind of summer group thing, and come up with their own symbols of things and traits that mean things to them. Super rad getting to go to the Metropolitan Museum Art with these kids. And the other thing too is I always talk about with students and other folks the E word and then the F word, keeping fun in this. And so, right, it's like this, the human experience and challenge, right, of like some really crappy things going on, but that doesn't mean that, it gets emotional and hard, but, to still have fun and goof around. So, all right, thank you.
Good morning. So I'm here to talk with you about a program that is just launching as a way of thinking about the future. As John pointed out, this is the very first program in the United States that is an MA in critical and historical craft studies. It's also a low residency program, and it's housed at Warren Wilson College, which some of you may know is a part of the Work Consortium schools. It started out as a farm school and has a long history of service and social justice as part of the fabric of the curriculum and the way the students learn. Going forward, this program is going to tie in as much as possible. Despite being low residency, it will be very much tied into those principles that Warren Wilson College is founded on. There are three main philosophical ideas that I am using in developing this program. The idea of yes and, the idea of, the idea of making space, and the idea of questions. And the reason that I'm starting with these three philosophies and not a list of the works and the readings and the kinds of people that people are going to need to be looking at is because we need to open up this category of craft and to understand it in a much broader way, in a more global way. When we say craft, which craft are we talking about? And this touches on a bit of what John was talking about. Are we talking about craft as it's defined in the United States? Are we talking about craft as it's defined in Norway, Japan, South Africa? It's different everywhere you go. And even in the United States, there's lots of debates about which craft we're talking about just here. Are we talking about a basket maker in Indonesia? Are we talking about studio craft? Are we talking about rural crafts and historic craft traditions like quilting? Making that happens in art schools seems to be the primary way we talk about craft, especially in our field, even in ceramics. Are we talking about the DIY knitting groups, the very casual so-called amateur groups? Are we talking about people like Lenora Tawney? Who are we talking about when we talk about craft, even in the United States? The other thing that we need this program to do is to open the conversation up for other ways of understanding how craft shifts and changes. The way that craft has an opportunity to bring in questions about gender and identity. The way that craft, the response time on this thingy is slow. Going ahead of it. We need to think about the way that tourist craft is brought into this conversation. And when we say tourist craft, I'm not talking about a old National Geographic model of just looking at the tourist craft that happens in other places, but thinking about the way that the crafts we have produced in the United States, the Appalachian region, for example, has operated within this tourist model. We need to look at what's happening in a new way, and this is one of the things that the students in this program will be doing. The other thing we need to do is to redefine what we mean when we say American. We are currently, right now, on land that is former Seneca and Lenape land, and I want to thank Courtney Leonard for helping me make sure I had the correct tribes that inhabited this space that we are on right now. When we say American craft and when we say American studio craft, where are the indigenous voices in this conversation? They're not part of a lot of the discussions, a lot of the books, a lot of the focus. This needs to become a part of the foundation of this program so that moving forward we can bring the globe into the program by representing all of the diversity in the United States itself. But on top of that, we also need to understand that Indigenous is not a monolithic category, and how Indigenous communities are dealing with craft in New Zealand, for example, or in India, is very different than the way that Indigenous communities are represented in the United States. So this program is going to work to do all of those too. But what we also need to do is to bring in immigrant stories, because I'll be honest, I want to see my story as a part of the history of craft too. What you see here are my grandparents and a tablecloth that my grandmother embroidered. My mother didn't like the way that she had embroidered it, and she made her redo it a couple of times so that it was exact and perfect and fit the dining table that we still have to this day. And then you see my whole family around the table. You want to see yourself reflected in history. I think immigrants want to see themselves reflected in history too. And to address a question that Janet brought up about the numbers of curators and people in the museum field who are of color, I can tell you that I am the first South Asian to direct a collecting art museum in the United States that's not an ethnically specific museum. That's a pretty terrible statistic in this day and age. And looking out there, when I left the field and when Larry Stokes Sims left the field in 2014, there are 2 new people who have come into the field who are curators of color in institutions, but that's it. So 2 for 2 is not improving anything, it's just replacing those numbers. So these are the things that need to change going forward as well. The other thing we need to understand is, how do we teach our students to understand that Anonymous was not the same woman in every part of the world? The anonymous women who built the Museum of Contemporary Craft, which was founded as Oregon Ceramic Studio at a time when they were unable to manage their own bank accounts, where they had to have a man as the president of the organization in order to sign all of the checks and ensure that they were doing things correctly. That is a very different anonymous woman from the kinds of women who create these beaded bags or the Rajasthani folk art that people love to collect. This particular bag was created by Medha Bhatt's great-grandmother, and when she left home, it was the last time that she had the chance to see her family. She was a young woman in her early teens. It was a bag that was taken with her in a dowry box that contained all the embroideries that her aunts and her mother and the women in her village had taught her how to do. And when she left with that on her lap in a cart, and her father said to her, "If they beat you, if they do anything that hurts you, better that you throw yourself in a well, because you cannot come home." These are the anonymous stories that are associated with these textiles that get collected as just beautiful folk arts. These are the kinds of stories that need to be brought out in craft histories as well. So the thing that this program is going to do is going to also address the forms that we use to address the subject of craft. And specifically, the primary form in graduate school is looking at research and writing. We look at books. And in the last 15 years, there has been a huge number of books that have been produced, and we really have to thank the Wingate Foundation in a large way for catalyzing this growth and development of critical discourse and theory about craft in a number of ways. The problem is, though, we haven't had a chance we're so busy documenting histories and getting the history down that we haven't had the chance to help our students, help us step back, look at who is writing. Are they writing for, or are they writing with? Are they writing about, or are they writing collaboratively and bringing in first-person narratives? Where that criticality is going to happen is in a program like this. And it's something that I try to practice myself. I've been working on a long-term project with Benjamin Lignell, who's going to be one of the instructors in the Warren Wilson program. This gender and adornment project basically draws from social sciences and anthropology and ethnography and uses a protocol method to interview people about their relationship with jewelry and gender. And the interviews have been transcribed. We're in the process of returning them to all of the interviewees who have the right to redact, adjust, respond to comments and questions, and give that back to us, and we will be publishing it in the form that collaboratively we agree best represents our conversation at that time. This is a new method it disrupts anthropology as much as it disrupts art history. These are the kinds of things we need to look at as we go forward in this field in order to bring in a different way of thinking about writing and critical discourse about craft. We also need to be thinking about the dialogue that happens through social media. Specifically, there are places where there are formal publications like Garland Magazine that was founded by Kevin Murray out of Australia. Garland Magazine is an international publication. What it does is it disrupts the transatlantic narrative of craft. The transatlantic narrative of craft is only one narrative. Not everything started with William Morris and Ruskin. Surprisingly, there's a lot of writers out there, a lot of other lenses. And what Garland Magazine does is it looks at the Pacific Rim as its region to focus on instead, but also extends into places like Iran and Iraq, and is bringing out a large variety of different forms of writing and critical attention to craft in a whole bunch of different ways that I think are really effective. This is available online. You all can go and look at it at any time and engage it. So it's also about making it publicly available and accessible. We also need students to understand what's happening in critical art discourse. And Hyperallergic is one of the quickest ways that a lot of us get our news and can spread the news and share news. Hyperallergic is definitely a good place to have students continue to develop craft writing. And Harag Vartanian, who is the editor, is going to be one of the mentors in the program. So it gives, and as is Kevin Murray. So it's going to give an opportunity for students to intersect in a number of different ways and a number of different kinds of writing. The other thing is a service model. And I know that Wikipedia is something that many of us have been dubious about for a number of years, but I can tell you after participating in Wikipedia-a-thons that Wikipedia is actually a really good source. And it is an excellent place to teach the historians and theorists of the future to build craft histories, make them available online. So the students will be learning as part of their service component, they will be writing histories of craft artists and craft museum exhibitions and so forth going forward on Wikipedia. They'll also be learning to share what they know. One of the most amazing experiences I had this past summer was at Watershed Center for Ceramic Arts, and I worked with a group of performative artists called the Brick Factory for 2 weeks. And in that experience, watching the way that artists tend to each other, help each other, discuss things with each other is entirely different than the way that art historians and curators work with each other. And I found that it was an excellent opportunity to rethink the way we're going to model public pedagogy, if you will, for our students. This is a bibliography that's also available online. It was created by Aaron Cifuentes and Lisa Weinbaum and myself, and we created it to share resources about unsettling coloniality. Specifically, it's very textile-oriented, but I guarantee there are some readings in there that you would be able to find productive and useful in your own work as well. It's also thinking about platforms like Critical Craft Forum, which I co-founded with Elizabeth Agro in 2009. It's a Facebook group with 11,000 people on it. It's growing. I have 30 more entries that are waiting to be processed today alone. And I've lost my slides. There we go. Critical Craft Forum is a place where it's about open dialogue between people in the craftscape. Curators talking to gallerists, talking to artists, talking to art historians. So it's a place where there's an opportunity, again, to take some of those kinds of conversations that happen in a studio environment and put them into a public space. We also need to have students who are understanding the shifts in the way that craft history is being documented and created. And I think Pots in Action is a great example of Instagram operating as an artist-run, really an artist-centric archive as much as it is a public sort of presentation of what's happening in ceramics today. It's a curatorial project, but it's a curatorial project where you, as the artists, are the gatekeepers in terms of what content goes in there. These kinds of models need to be addressed in craft by craft historians and craft theorists as well. Curating and the public presentation of craft is obviously an important part, and museums and museum exhibitions are certainly going to be a part of this program as well. We will be looking through art history, but we will also be trying to figure out where art history needs to shift, or perhaps where craft as a field needs to develop. This is the only part of the visual arts where the reader preceded the development of an actual department. Glenn Adamson's fantastic craft reader came out about 10 years ago, and it is only now that we are actually creating a field itself. So it's a very interesting thing to think about how that operates. But it also ties in with this idea of where history is being created and being constructed. And frankly, in craft world, exhibitions are craft history. And we need to understand how to help document that. The exhibitions that happen at NSECA every year are a flash and they're gone. How is that being tracked? How is that being recorded? This is just history that just disappears like this. And then in the field, we throw up our hands saying, nobody's tracking what we're doing. We need to find ways to track that kind of exhibition history as much as what's going on in museums. We also need to understand that craft histories are not just located in the major art museums that we want to see craft represented in. The Wing Luke Museum of Asian American Experience, for example, is a place where I did an exhibition that connected the collection to contemporary artists working with textiles. You all have history museums, small craft institutions where you live. Those are the places where craft histories are happening through exhibitions, and they are just as valid as MoMA, perhaps more valid than MoMA. Because if you go to MoMA, here's what happens. You go into the archive. People do research at MoMA in the archive. I'm going to go off on my MoMA tangent for a second. I am so tired of going to textile conferences or conferences where people talk about textiles and they quote MoMA as the archive, or they looked at MoMA. And 1968, the show that Jack Larson and Mildred Constantine put together is the show that they constantly reference. There's a lot of textile shows that have happened since 1968 that have had a huge impact on the textiles area and on contemporary art. So we need to be teaching our students and all of you out there not to just rely on MoMAs, but to go to other archives as well. And I'll get back to that subject in a minute. But we also need to consider other forms that are opening up platforms for new curatorial models that represent the field. 2 years ago, Michael Strand and I did a project here for NSECA called Across the Table, Across the Land. And basically, you were invited to give us your stories and your images that were about objects, ceramic objects that connected food and community. From what you gave to us, we created an exhibition. We used our curatorial strategies to take the content that you delivered and put together an exhibition that included a whole range of stories and included things from elementary school children all the way to people who are and have been widely recognized in the field for a long time. These are the kinds of things that we need to help students in the future develop for craft. We also need to think about the form of teaching itself. And specifically, I actually use Glenn's craft reader and work against it in some ways and redistribute the categories that he set up, because those categories, for me, they opened up a way to sort of push back on them. And if you start teaching the history of contemporary craft from the 1930s, and you start with the Bauhaus, you start with the essay on Swadeshi, and you start with the essay on the Mingei movement, you introduce to the students that Swadeshi is about craft as part of revolution and the hand as part of revolution. You introduce the Mingei movement and the idea of national identity and authorship. And then you're introducing the Bauhaus, and you help them understand the relationship between the hand and the machine. And all of this is happening concurrently, and it moves you away from this idea of the Industrial Revolution being a singular story and the demise of craft. It actually shifts everything, and it makes the contemporary make sense. We also need to be finding ways to have the histories that have been constructed by our faculty and our teachers of craft histories, our makers. You have been the custodians of craft history. Art history is late to the game. So your stories, your histories, your ways of teaching, your material practices need to be understood better by art historians, and that's something this program will look to. We need to expand the subject. We need to look at conferences like College Art Association. We need to look at things that Norwegian Crafts and other craft organizations around the world are doing to build discourse, both online and through conferences as well. And we need to ask ourselves where the craft archives is. I get really upset about MoMA, so sometimes I go off on the MoMA thing a little before this. But what we need to do is think about the craft archives that are out there. For example, craft archives are in used bookstores. In Portland, if you go to the used bookstores, you can find books from the 70s and 80s that will tell you a story about textile history that is completely different than what you're going to get in a classroom. When you go to Watershed, you see this door that documents people who were able to participate in ceramics workshops during the AIDS epidemic when they weren't allowed to do any of these kinds of things in New York City. You also can go to Archie Bray and see objects amongst the landscape as part of craft history. These are archives that we need to be looking at and understanding as well. So it's really about voices and histories. It's about understanding that Swannanoa and Asheville for this program is going to function as a laboratory. It's going to be a place where students are going to test out their ideas, test out their learning to do oral histories, learning to understand what the craftscape looks like. They're going to be connecting with craft institutions and mapping craft history right in that region. And then what they're going to be doing is taking what they learn and going home and mapping where they live and connecting it all. So in this way, this program's aim is to really create a constellation, an understanding of craft histories as very broad, very diverse, interconnected, but also locally specific as well. And this will be a model then, our ambition is to make this a model then that can be transferred into a global context. So we're not just thinking about America as being this transatlantic, Eurocentric kind of craft, but that we understand that when you study craft in the United States, you study the world because the world is here. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll quick do a couple of questions, then we can also, I think all of us can meet you out front if there are further questions. So if anyone has a question, if you could go up to the mic over here. We need you to go to the mic so it's recorded. Thanks.
Could you reintroduce everyone, just so we can kind of fix in our mind, everyone and their message? Thank you.
Jesse Albrecht, I work with veterans and use craft as like a side door into art.
I'm Namita Wiggers, and I'm the director of new MA in Critical and Historical Craft Studies at Warren Wilson College, and I also run Critical Craft Forum.
And I'm Janet McCall, Executive Director of Contemporary Craft here in Pittsburgh.
I'm John Brown with Chipstone. Any other questions? I'll quick ask one which has to do with, we talked about some of the barriers we each run into, whether it's sort of definitional barriers in the field or institutional barriers, intellectual barriers that then play out in racial, gender, ethnographic, or ethnic issues. Do you all run into barriers within your organizations or within the communities in which you work? And then how do you get past those hurdles and sort of evaluate? We often get asked by people, how do you evaluate the work that you're doing? And museums often turn to metrics, and I think that's an interesting question to ask about the efficacy of metrics. So how do you measure the value of what you do?
Let's see, measuring the value of what I do. I guess it's on a human level, and it's kind of like an anecdotal thing of me noticing the level of engagement and knowing that I'm not going to hit everybody, but if I can get you know, 2/3, that's a huge victory. 1/3 is, you know, okay, and then, you know, you gotta sometimes bottom line and say, hey, if I can really affect one person and change how they look at the world or feel about their life, like that's, to me, that's worth it.
I did mention some of the metrics in terms of our social justice series that made us realize that we were heading in a very good direction in terms of community response, spike in attendance, and very strong funding. And some of our partners actually nominated us for awards without us realizing it for these shows. In terms of barriers, our small size gives us a lot of flexibility and freedom for the most part, so we can take some risks, which is really great. But I will say that we had some funders, more on the individual side rather than foundation side, who were very concerned about these shows when we started. And we did hear some conversations like, oh, you know, I don't know if my friends are going to want to come and see this show. We had a community leader who said, oh, I don't do violence. But over time, we were able to continue the conversation and actually get them to a place where they could see the results themselves. And again, the human metric is the most important, the stories that they heard and the conversations they had about the responses.
So this program is brand new. So I'm literally in the midst of reviewing the applications and choosing the students for the very first class. And I will tell you that I'm thrilled with the applications. I would like in the future to have far more diversity, both geographic, economic, and ethnic diversity. But the problem is the pipeline. It's not, you know, and so it's my responsibility now to figure out how am I going to shift that pipeline and open up the opportunity to make sure that I can diversify that. The way that I'm kind of trying to counter that in terms of value is to make sure that the faculty and the students who are in the program are going to receive a diverse range of approaches and concepts, and really, I mean, right from the get-go, they're going to be visiting the Cherokee Museum and visiting with Cherokee community artists and learning about the region immediately. So it's about trying to make sure that I put the programming where my values are.
Yeah. Part of the reason this is relevant is that these kinds of inspired, progressive, so-called alternative practices, trying to get them into the mainstream institutions, whatever those are, some of the kickback that we get are stakeholders or directors at institutions saying, well, this seems risky. How do we, when in fact the riskiest thing they can do is to say no to your kind of projects.
So I think the thing for me, to just thinking about what you just said, is, you know, when I get told that I'm being political or I'm being, radical, I don't understand how that can possibly be the case if I'm simply saying what's out there. And I think it's important to understand, too, in terms of museums, I was a fellow at the Smithsonian in 1992 in an initiative that was developed that was already 10 years old at that point to change the demographics of museum leadership in a number of different fields. And still, to this day, we're acting as if it's a new thing. So I think there's a lot more that needs to change.
There's still walls out there.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.